Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela was born on the 18th of July, 1918, in the tiny village of Mvezo in South Africa's Cape Province. His birth name, Rolihlahla, comes from the Xhosa language and literally means pulling the branch of a tree, but it is more commonly translated as troublemaker. A fitting name, in hindsight, for a man who would later shake the foundations of an entire nation. Mandela was born into the Thembu royal family, part of the Xhosa-speaking peoples of southern Africa. His father, Gadla Henry Mfakeni-Yiswa, served as chief of Mvezo, but when Mandela was still a child, his father fell into conflict with the local colonial authorities. Stripped of his title and fortune, the family was left to live in much humbler conditions. This early fall from privilege exposed young Rolihlahla to the precarious balance of power under white colonial rule. When Mandela was only 9 years old, his father died of lung disease. Following Xhosa custom, Mandela was taken in by the regent of the Thembu nation, Chief Janjantaba Dalindibo. Under Janjantaba's guardianship, Mandela was given opportunities that few black South Africans could dream of during those years. He attended a Methodist mission school, where his teachers encouraged discipline and education. It was there that he was given a new name, Nelson, by a teacher, following the colonial practice of giving English names to African children. As a boy, Mandela's life in Kanu was simple. He herded cattle, played games with other village children, and listened to elders tell stories of old African wars of resistance. These tales of bravery against foreign domination left a lasting impression on him. At age 16, Mandela underwent the traditional Xhosa initiation rite into manhood, a ritual that made him feel part of an unbroken chain of history and heritage. In 1939, Mandela enrolled at the University of Fort Hare, one of the few institutions of higher education open to black South Africans. It was at Fort Hare that his world began to expand. He studied English, anthropology, politics, and Roman Dutch law, mingling with fellow students who would later become leaders in their own right. Yet Mandela was not content with simply studying. When he and his peers organized a protest against the university's policies, he was expelled, a foreshadowing of his lifelong resistance to unjust authority. Refusing to give up, Mandela later pursued his studies through the University of South Africa and eventually moved to Johannesburg. There, he would attend the University of Witwatersrand, where he was one of only a handful of black students. Though he faced racism and isolation, Mandela persevered in his studies. More importantly, it was here that he began forming friendships and connections that would pull him deeper into politics and law, laying the foundation for his rise as a revolutionary leader. By the end of his student years, Nelson Mandela was no longer just Rolihlahla, the boy who herded cattle in Kanu. He had become a young man with a sharp mind, a restless spirit, and a deep awareness of the racial injustices suffocating South Africa. Education had not only shaped his intellect, it had also sparked the fire of his political awakening. After leaving Fort Hare and continuing his studies, Nelson Mandela made his way to Johannesburg, the bustling industrial heart of South Africa. At first, his life there was anything but glamorous. He worked odd jobs, including as a night watchman, before landing a position as a law clerk. The city was a place of sharp contrasts, dazzling opportunities for the white minority, but harsh oppression for the black majority. It was here that Mandela began to fully grasp the crushing weight of apartheid. While working in the law firm of Witkin, Seidelski, and Edelman, Mandela pursued his law degree part-time. The firm's partners, progressive in their own right, encouraged him, but Mandela faced constant reminders of the color line that defined South African society. He was often denied service in restaurants, forced to use segregated facilities, and treated as an outsider in the classrooms of the University of Witwatersrand. These experiences sharpened his awareness of the injustices surrounding him and gave him the resolve to fight them. Johannesburg also brought Mandela into contact with people who would shape his destiny. Chief among them was Walter Sisulu, a real estate agent with deep ties to the African National Congress, the ANC. Sisulu introduced Mandela to a wider circle of activists, thinkers, and leaders. Through Sisulu, Mandela met Oliver Tambo, who would become his lifelong friend and comrade in the struggle. Together, these men would build a network that would challenge the very foundations of apartheid. By the early 1940s, Mandela had joined the African National Congress, which had been founded decades earlier to fight for the rights of black South Africans. At that time, however, the ANC was still a relatively conservative organization, relying mainly on petitions and polite appeals to the government. Mandela and his younger colleagues believed that this cautious approach was not enough. In 1944, he, Sisulu, and Tambo helped to establish the ANC Youth League, an organization determined to push the movement in a more radical and mass-based direction. Mandela's legal career was developing at the same time. In 1952, alongside Oliver Tambo, he co-founded the first black-run law firm in South Africa, Mandela and Tambo. The firm quickly became a refuge for black South Africans facing police harassment, land evictions, and the daily humiliations of apartheid law. While white lawyers often refused to defend black clients, Mandela and Tambo offered affordable legal aid, defending their people in courtrooms that were stacked against them. His dual role as lawyer and activist gave Mandela a unique perspective. In the courtroom, He fought individual injustices one case at a time. In the political arena, he began organizing mass campaigns to dismantle the entire system of racial oppression. This combination of professional skill and political vision transformed Mandela from a struggling young law clerk into a rising figure within South Africa's liberation movement. By the close of the 1940s, Mandela had not only earned his law degree, but had also become a prominent voice within the ANC. Johannesburg had turned him into something more than a student of the law. It had made him a strategist, an organizer, and above all, a leader in the making. By the late 1940s, South Africa was tightening its grip on racial segregation. In 1948, the National Party came to power and formally introduced the system that would come to be known worldwide as apartheid. Under this policy, every aspect of life was dictated by race: where you could live, where you could work, even whom you could marry. For Nelson Mandela and his comrades in the ANC Youth League, this was no time for moderation. Mandela and his colleagues pushed the ANC to abandon its cautious approach of petitions and negotiations, calling instead for direct action. Inspired by independence movements abroad and the global rise of anti-colonial struggles, they demanded a more militant strategy. In 1949, their program of action was adopted, committing the ANC to strikes, boycotts, and civil disobedience. Mandela quickly rose to prominence. His organizational skills and fiery speeches drew attention, and by 1952, he was chosen to play a leading role in the Defiance campaign, the first large-scale, multiracial challenge to apartheid. Thousands of volunteers deliberately broke segregation laws, entering whites-only areas, refusing to carry passbooks, and occupying restricted public spaces. Mandela traveled the country rallying people, urging them to stand firm in the face of arrests and intimidation. The campaign was a turning point. For the first time, masses of ordinary South Africans openly defied the apartheid state. Though the government cracked down harshly, arresting more than 8,000 protesters, including Mandela himself, the Defiance campaign placed him firmly in the national spotlight. It was also during this period that he was formally banned for the first time, restricted from public gatherings, and confined to Johannesburg. Despite the bans, Mandela's influence grew. He helped draft the Freedom Charter in 1955, a document calling for a non-racial South Africa based on democracy, equality, and human rights. It was a bold vision, one that stood in direct opposition to the apartheid government's obsession with racial separation. Mandela's increasing activism came at a personal cost. His marriage to Evelyn Ntoko Mays, with whom he had 4 children, collapsed under the strain of his political commitments. Yet his dedication to the cause never wavered. He was becoming not just an activist, but a revolutionary leader who embodied the aspirations of millions of South Africans yearning for freedom. By the end of the 1950s, Mandela had transformed from a lawyer handling individual cases to a national figure challenging the entire apartheid system. His rise marked the beginning of a struggle that would grow fiercer, more dangerous, and more uncompromising in the years to come. The 1960s opened with bloodshed that changed the course of Nelson Mandela's life and the entire liberation struggle. On March 21, 1960, police opened fire on peaceful demonstrators in the township of Sharpeville, killing 69 people and wounding hundreds more. The massacre shocked the world and convinced many South Africans that peaceful protest alone could never bring down apartheid. In the aftermath, the government banned the African National Congress. Its leaders, including Mandela, were forced underground. It was during this time that Mandela and his allies made a historic decision to form a new organization called Umkhonto we Sizwe, Spear of the Nation, often shortened to MK. Unlike the ANC's earlier strategies, MK was committed to sabotage, acts designed to cripple the government's infrastructure without causing loss of life. Targets included electricity pylons, military installations, and transport networks. Mandela became MK's first commander-in-chief. He secretly traveled across Africa, seeking training and support from newly independent countries, and even visited London. Disguised and always on the move, he became known as the Black Pimpernel, constantly evading the security police. His mission was no longer limited to the courtroom or the protest march. It was now a campaign to dismantle apartheid by force if necessary. But in 1962, Mandela's luck ran out. He was arrested and charged with incitement and illegal departure from the country, earning a 5-year prison sentence. Yet, even behind bars, the authorities were determined to silence him permanently. In 1963, police raided a farm at Rivonia, outside Johannesburg, and discovered documents tying ANC leaders to acts of sabotage. Mandela and several comrades were put on trial for sabotage, conspiracy, and attempts to overthrow the state. The proceedings, known as the Rivonia Trial, became one of the most famous court cases of the 20th century. Facing the death penalty, Mandela delivered a speech that would echo across history. He admitted to planning sabotage but denied seeking to kill civilians. He spoke of his vision for a democratic, non-racial South Africa. And in closing, he declared, "I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society in which all persons live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. It is an ideal which I hope to live for and to achieve. But if needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die." Those words electrified supporters at home and abroad. Instead of execution, Mandela and his fellow defendants were sentenced to life imprisonment. With that judgment, Mandela disappeared from public view, beginning what would become 27 long years in captivity. But his defiance in the courtroom ensured that, even behind bars, his voice could never truly be silenced. On the 12th of June, 1964, Nelson Mandela was led away from the courtroom to begin a life sentence. His destination was Robben Island, a windswept rock off the coast of Cape Town, where the apartheid regime sent its most defiant political prisoners. The conditions were brutal. Mandela's cell measured barely 2 meters by 2.5, furnished with nothing more than a straw mat on the floor. He was denied shoes, forced to wear shorts regardless of the weather, and forbidden to receive newspapers. Along with other inmates, he was assigned to break rocks in a limestone quarry, hard, blinding work that permanently damaged his eyesight. Meals were meager, often little more than maize porridge, and contact with the outside world was tightly restricted. Visits from family were rare and heavily monitored. Letters, when allowed, were censored, with entire sections blacked out by prison authorities. Yet even under such harsh restrictions, Mandela refused to be broken. He turned the prison into what he would later call a university. Inmates held secret classes, teaching one another history, politics, and law. Mandela himself lectured younger prisoners on leadership, strategy, and the philosophy of non-racial democracy. His discipline and calm under pressure set him apart. Guards who tried to humiliate him found themselves faced with quiet dignity that slowly earned their respect. Fellow prisoners began to see him as their natural leader, someone who could embody their hopes even in the darkest moments. Years stretched into decades. In 1982, Mandela and several other leaders were transferred from Robben Island to Pollsmoor Prison on the mainland. Conditions there were somewhat better, but his health was declining. Later, he was moved again to Victor Verster Prison, where he lived in a small house within the compound. By then, the government was beginning secret talks with him, hoping to negotiate a way out of South Africa's growing crisis. Outside the prison walls, Mandela's name had become a rallying cry. Across the world, students, workers, and governments demanded his release. The slogan, "Free Nelson Mandela," appeared on posters, badges, and concert stages from London to New York. Sanctions and boycotts isolated South Africa, while protests at home made the country increasingly ungovernable. Through it all, Mandela remained a symbol of defiance. He had entered prison as a militant leader of a banned organization. He emerged as the moral center of a global movement. His 27 years in captivity had transformed him from a political prisoner into an icon of freedom. By the late 1980s, even the apartheid government knew that the future could not be negotiated without him. The question was no longer if Nelson Mandela would be released, but when. By the mid-1980s, South Africa was on the brink. International sanctions were crippling the economy, mass uprisings filled the streets, and the apartheid system was crumbling under its own weight. From his prison cell, Nelson Mandela had become not just a South African figure, but a symbol of resistance recognized around the globe. The government could no longer ignore him. In 1985, President P.W. Botha offered Mandela his freedom, on one condition, that he renounce armed struggle. Mandela refused. In a statement smuggled from his prison cell, he declared, "Only free men can negotiate. Prisoners cannot enter into contracts." For Mandela, true freedom could never come at the price of surrendering the struggle for equality. Behind the scenes, however, secret talks were already underway. Government officials began meeting privately with Mandela at Pollsmoor Prison, testing the waters for possible negotiations. These conversations laid the groundwork for the seismic changes to come. In 1989, F.W. de Klerk became South Africa's new president. Unlike his predecessors, de Klerk recognized that apartheid had no future. In a dramatic move, he unbanned the African National Congress and other liberation movements, signaling the beginning of a new era. Finally, on February 11, 1990, after 27 years behind bars, Nelson Mandela walked out of Victor Verster Prison. Television cameras broadcast the moment live across the world. Hand in hand with his then-wife Winnie, Mandela raised a clenched fist to the sky as thousands cheered. It was more than the release of a prisoner. It was the rebirth of hope for an entire nation. But the fight was far from over. The years that followed were marked by tense negotiations, outbreaks of violence, and the ever-present threat of civil war. Mandela and de Klerk sat across the table from one another, hammering out the terms of South Africa's transition. Despite their differences, they shared a determination to avoid bloodshed. In 1993, Mandela and de Klerk were jointly awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for their efforts. And in April 1994, South Africa held its first fully democratic elections. For the first time in history, Black South Africans could vote as equals. Millions lined up at polling stations in scenes of jubilation. When the results were announced, Nelson Mandela had been elected as the country's first Black president. The struggle that had begun decades earlier, in classrooms, courtrooms, and prison cells, had finally reached its greatest victory. On May 10, 1994, Nelson Mandela stood on the steps of the Union buildings in Pretoria, taking the oath of office as South Africa's first Black president. For the millions who had waited decades for this day, it was nothing short of historic. The man who had once been branded a terrorist was now the democratically elected leader of a free nation. Mandela's presidency was never about revenge. Instead, he chose reconciliation. His central challenge was to unite a country scarred by centuries of racial division. He often spoke of building a rainbow nation, where South Africans of all backgrounds could live together as equals. One of his most important initiatives was the establishment of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, led by Archbishop Desmond Tutu. The commission gave victims of apartheid the chance to share their stories, while also allowing perpetrators to confess their crimes in exchange for amnesty. It was a painful process, but Mandela believed that confronting the past openly was the only way to heal the nation. On the international stage, Mandela worked tirelessly to reintroduce South Africa to the global community. Sanctions were lifted, diplomatic ties restored, and the country began to take its place as a respected member of the world once again. Mandela himself became a symbol of moral authority, welcomed by leaders from Washington to Beijing. At home, his government faced immense challenges. Apartheid had left South Africa with staggering inequality, a struggling economy, and widespread poverty. Mandela's administration launched ambitious programs to expand housing, healthcare, and education for the black majority who had long been excluded. Progress was slow, but the direction was clear. South Africa was no longer a state built on racial privilege, but one striving for social justice. Mandela also understood the power of symbols. Perhaps the most famous example came during the 1995 Rugby World Cup, hosted by South Africa. Rugby had long been seen as a white man's sport, tied closely to the apartheid regime. Yet Mandela appeared at the final wearing the jersey of the Springboks, the national rugby team, and handed the trophy to Captain Francois Pienaar after their victory. The gesture stunned the world and sent a powerful message of unity, one nation, celebrating together. Despite his immense popularity, Mandela chose not to seek a second term. In 1999, after just 5 years in office, he stepped down, handing power to his deputy, Thabo Mbeki. In doing so, Mandela reinforced his belief that democracy is not about strongmen clinging to power, but about institutions and the people's will. Mandela's presidency was far from perfect. Critics noted that many social and economic inequalities remained deeply entrenched, but his leadership set the foundation for a new South Africa. Above all, his decision to govern with forgiveness rather than vengeance transformed what could have been a bloodbath into a miracle of peaceful transition. When Nelson Mandela left the presidency in 1999, he could easily have retired into quiet dignity. Instead, he stepped onto the global stage as one of the most respected moral leaders of the modern era. Freed from the daily burdens of politics, Mandela dedicated his later years to causes close to his heart. Through the Nelson Mandela Foundation, he championed education, rural development, and the promotion of democracy and human rights. He believed that true freedom was not just about casting a vote, but about ensuring dignity, opportunity, and justice for all. One of Mandela's most significant campaigns was the fight against HIV/AIDS. At the height of the epidemic in South Africa, government denial and silence left millions vulnerable. Mandela broke that silence. He spoke openly about the disease and its stigma, even after losing his own son, Makatho, to AIDS-related complications in 2005. By confronting the issue directly, Mandela helped shift attitudes and inspired a new era of awareness and prevention. Mandela also became a tireless advocate for peace far beyond South Africa's borders. He supported mediation efforts in Burundi and other African nations torn by conflict. His voice carried extraordinary weight. When Mandela called for peace, the world listened. Over the years, he received more than 250 honors from around the globe, from the U.S. Presidential Medal of Freedom to the Order of Lenin, from honorary degrees to streets and buildings bearing his name. In 2009, the United Nations declared his birthday, July 18th, as Nelson Mandela International Day, calling on people worldwide to devote 67 minutes of their time. 1 minute for each year he spent in public service, to acts of kindness and community service. Despite the accolades, Mandela remained strikingly humble. He often joked about his own flaws, insisting that he was not a saint, but a sinner who keeps on trying. To admirers worldwide, that humility only deepened his moral authority. By the early 2000s, age and illness slowed him down. He gradually withdrew from public life, spending more time with his family, though he continued to inspire from the sidelines. His very presence, the image of a man who had endured so much yet preached forgiveness, was enough to move crowds to tears. Even in retirement, Mandela was not simply a former president. He had become something greater, a living symbol of resilience, justice, and reconciliation, whose influence transcended borders and generations. On the 5th of December, 2013, Nelson Mandela passed away at the age of 95. News of his death spread instantly across the globe, and with it came an outpouring of grief and gratitude. In South Africa, people gathered in the streets, singing songs of struggle and freedom. Across the world, flags flew at half-mast, and leaders of every nation paid tribute. Rarely in history had one man's passing united so many. Mandela's funeral was attended by presidents, kings, and prime ministers. Yet Yet the most powerful tributes came not from politicians, but from ordinary people. They remembered the man who had walked free after 27 years in prison without bitterness, who had chosen reconciliation over revenge, and who had given them the gift of democracy. His legacy cannot be measured only in policies or speeches. It lives in the idea that forgiveness can be stronger than hate, that courage can outlast oppression, and that even the most unjust system can be dismantled through persistence and vision. Mandela once said, "Courage is not the absence of fear, it's inspiring others to move beyond it." Today, Nelson Mandela remains more than a historical figure. He is a symbol. His life is a reminder that change is possible, no matter how entrenched injustice may seem. For South Africa, he was the father of the nation. For the world, he was, and still is, a beacon of freedom, dignity, and humanity.